The Grand Conclave Hall on Verath Station had seen many things in its 400 years of existence. It had seen wars end with handshakes. It had seen alliances collapse over a single wrong word. It had seen species that once tried to destroy each other sit at the same curved table and share the same recycled air. But in all those 400 years, it had never seen anything quite like a human carrying a thermos of coffee into the most powerful diplomatic chamber in the known galaxy. Nathan Cole set the thermos down on the human delegation's small table near the far left side of the hall. It was a battered old thing, dark green, with a small dent near the bottom that had been there for years. He placed it beside his notebook, actual paper, actual pen, and pulled out his chair and sat down like a man settling in for a long meeting at a job he had been doing quietly for a very long time. Around him, the hall was enormous. The ceiling stretched up so high that the top of it disappeared into a soft, engineered mist that the Vreth architects had installed centuries ago for aesthetic reasons no one fully remembered anymore. The walls curved inward in a gentle arc, lined with the banners of 14 civilizations, each one lit from below by a pale, steady light. The delegates from those civilizations were arriving now, filling their seats, their aides moving around them with the busy, careful energy of people who understood that every small thing in this room carried weight. The Vreth delegation arrived last, as they always did. It was a tradition that communicated, without anyone having to say it, that they considered themselves the natural center of these proceedings. Ambassador Lyris led them in. She was tall even by Vreth standards, her silver skin catching the hall's light in a way that made her seem almost metallic. She wore deep blue ceremonial robes that moved around her like water, and she walked with the particular kind of slowness that powerful people use when they want everyone to have time to notice them. Her eyes passed over the hall as she took her seat. They moved across the Grath delegation, the Solon cluster representatives, the old and serious faces of the Murath collective. They paused for a fraction of a second on the human table, on Nathan Cole, his notebook, his thermos, and then moved on with the mild disinterest of someone who has glanced at a piece of furniture. Owen Park noticed. He was 26 years old, and this was his first conclave. He had spent 8 months preparing for it, reading records, studying protocol, memorizing the names and faces and political sensitivities of every delegation. He sat 2 seats to Nathan's left, and he was trying very hard not to look nervous, which meant he was looking at everything too carefully. He had noticed the way Lyris looked at Nathan. He noticed because it was the same look a person gives a chair they are about to sit on without checking if it is sturdy. Diane Walsh sat 1 row behind both of them. She was in plain dark clothes with no insignia, which was how she preferred it. Her job was to watch the room, so she watched the room. She had been doing that kind of work long enough that her face gave nothing away regardless of what she was thinking. The conclave session opened with the moderator, a tall, thin being from the Narathi Republic whose species was trusted with running these proceedings precisely because they had no strong alliances with anyone, reading the formal opening in 3 of the major galactic languages. Then came the recitation period. Each civilization's lead delegate would stand and give an account of their contributions to galactic welfare over the past decade. It was partly ceremony and partly record-keeping and partly, if everyone was being honest, a chance for the powerful to remind everyone else of exactly how powerful they were. The Grath went first. They spoke about their expanded patrol routes in 3 contested corridors, and the reduction in piracy those routes had produced. The Solon presented new atmospheric data they had shared with 4 neighboring systems. The Murath spoke for 11 minutes about their contributions to conclave infrastructure funding. Each presentation landed with the comfortable weight of expected things. Then it was humanity's turn. Nathan Cole stood up. He did not straighten his jacket because his jacket did not need straightening. He opened his notebook to a page near the middle, looked at it for a moment, and then looked up at the hall. He began to speak in a calm and even voice about what humanity had done over the past 10 years. Not what humanity had built for itself, what it had done for others. He talked about a package of medical research that human scientists had spent 4 years developing and then simply given. No agreement, no trade attached. to 3 civilizations whose populations were being slowly damaged by a respiratory condition that those civilizations lacked the resources to study properly. He talked about a series of 17 deep space relay stations that human engineers had constructed along routes that benefited shipping lanes used almost entirely by non-human vessels. He talked about a quiet moment 6 years ago when 2 civilizations at the table today had been moving toward open conflict over a territorial misunderstanding, and how a small team of human diplomats had spent 4 months working behind the scenes, speaking to both sides separately, slowly walking both of them back from a line that, if crossed, would have cost many lives. He was 4 minutes into speaking when Ambassador Lyris interrupted him. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. Her voice carried the way the voices of people who are always listened to tend to carry, easily, and with the assumption that whatever it interrupted was less important than what was about to be said. She said that humans were well known throughout the conclave for 2 things: their emotional nature, which made them unpredictable, and their deep love of telling stories about themselves that made those stories sound larger than they truly were. She said his list sounded like the humble brag of a small civilization trying very hard to seem significant. She said it with a slight tilt of her head and the corners of her mouth doing something that was not quite a smile. The hall responded, not loudly. A ripple of sound, low and brief, from several of the delegations whose relationship with the Vreth Dominion made agreement the safer and more comfortable option. Owen Park stopped breathing for a moment. Diane Walsh behind him did not move. Nathan Cole stood at the speaker's position and looked at Ambassador Lyris for a moment. Then he looked down at his notebook. Then he looked back up. He said very simply and very quietly, "Thank you for your perspective, Ambassador." And he sat down. The ripple of sound continued a moment longer. A few delegates exchanged looks. One of the Vreth aides leaned toward another and said something behind a raised hand. And then the sound stopped. Because the conclave data verification pillar at the center of the hall, a column of pale gold light that had not activated in 31 years, that only activated when evidence of galactic significance had been submitted and not yet formally entered into record, had begun very quietly to glow. The glow started small. It came from the base of the verification pillar first, a soft pulse of gold light that moved upward through the column slowly, like something waking up after a long sleep. Most of the delegates had never seen it activate in their lifetimes. A few of the older ones had seen it once, maybe twice. None of them had seen it activate on its own, without anyone approaching it, without any delegate formally requesting verification of anything. It simply turned on. And the hall, which had been carrying the low, comfortable noise of people who felt they had just watched something mildly amusing, went completely silent. Owen Park watched the pillar and felt the silence land on the room the way a heavy thing lands on a wooden floor. Sudden. Final. He looked at Nathan Cole. Nathan was sitting with his hands folded on his notebook, looking at the pillar with an expression that was not quite surprise. It was more like the expression of a man who has sent a letter a long time ago and has just heard a knock at the door. The neutral AI voice of the verification system spoke. It did not come from any single direction. It came from everywhere in the hall at once, calm and without feeling, the way a system speaks when it has no interest in the drama of what it is about to say. It announced that a sealed evidence cache, registered under authorization code belonging to the human delegation, had been held in the Conclave's secure archive for 7 years. It announced that under Article 41 of the original Conclave Charter, a very old article that most delegates knew existed, but few had ever seen used, a newly admitted species could submit evidence of actions taken in service of galactic welfare, seal that evidence, and request that it be opened only upon the completion of their 11th year of membership. The article existed because the founders of the Conclave had understood something simple, that young civilizations helping older ones might face political retaliation if their involvement became known too soon. The seal was a protection. The 11-year wait was the point at which that protection was no longer necessary. Humanity's 11th year of conclave membership had begun 4 days ago. The pillar's glow had reached the top now. The column of gold light stood full and steady in the center of the hall. Nathan Cole stood up, walked to the pillar, and placed his hand briefly on the reader panel at its base. The cache unlocked. The evidence began to display across the hall's shared projection surface, visible to every delegate at the table. What appeared first was a star map. It showed the Vreth Dominion's inner agricultural territories, a cluster of 6 planets that produced the majority of the food supply for the Dominion's core population. Then the map zoomed in on the supply chain routes that connected those planets. Distribution hubs, transport corridors, processing stations. Ambassador Lyris looked at the map. Her expression did not change, but something behind it shifted, the way the surface of still water shifts when something moves beneath it. Then the data began to appear beside the map. Biological data, complex and dense, the kind of information that took serious scientific work to produce. The verification system's voice began to explain it in plain language so that every delegation in the hall could follow. 7 years ago, a slow-acting biological contaminant had been introduced into the Vreth Dominion's primary agricultural supply chain. It had been engineered to look exactly like a naturally occurring crop disease. It was not natural. It was designed, carefully and with significant technical knowledge, to spread through the distribution system gradually and without triggering the Dominion's standard biosecurity alerts. The projections showed what would have happened if it had continued undetected. In the first 2 years, nothing visible. In year 3, a minor reduction in yields that would have been blamed on weather patterns. In year 4, a significant collapse. By year 5, the Dominion's food infrastructure across its core planets would have been in a state of crisis severe enough to cause widespread shortages, civil unrest, and likely internal conflict on a scale that the Dominion had not experienced in over a century. The hall was so quiet that the soft hum of the station's air systems was audible. Nathan stepped back slightly and let the verification system continue. The next set of files appeared. They were mission logs, clean, detailed, written with the particular careful precision of someone who understood that these records might one day matter enormously. A human xenobiologist named Carol Fenn had been part of a small survey team operating near the outer edge of Vreth territorial space 7 years ago. Her team was not there for any military or intelligence purpose. They were cataloging deep space biological drift patterns, routine scientific work. During that survey, Carol Fenn had detected trace elements of the contaminant in a sample collected near one of the Dominion's outer distribution hubs. She had recognized it for what it was. That alone had taken 3 weeks of work because the contaminant had been designed specifically not to be recognized. She had then traced its spread pattern backward through the distribution chain, mapping how far it had already moved and how far it would go. That had taken another 5 weeks. At that point, Carol Fenn had a choice. She could report it through official channels. That would have meant involving the conclave, triggering a political investigation into who had engineered the contaminant and why, and almost certainly causing a wave of diplomatic disruption that the verification system's own risk assessment, included in the files, estimated would likely destabilize 2 neighboring systems that were already fragile. She chose not to do that. Instead, she sent a detailed report to a human logistics coordination team, flagged at the highest priority level she had access to, and asked them if it was possible to neutralize the contaminant at every distribution point across the Dominion's agricultural network without anyone noticing the operation had taken place. The logistics team had come back to her within 48 hours. They said yes. What followed in the mission logs was 18 months of quiet, careful, exhausting work. Small human vessels moving through Vreth space on what appeared to be routine survey and shipping routes. Technicians at distribution hubs making what appeared to be minor equipment adjustments. The contaminant being neutralized point by point across the entire network. The Vreth Dominion's biosecurity systems had never flagged anything unusual. The Dominion's agricultural scientists had recorded a slightly better than expected harvest in the 3rd year and attributed it to favorable atmospheric conditions. The Dominion never knew. The Conclave never knew. The people of the Vreth Dominion had simply gone on with their lives, eating their food, raising their families, entirely unaware that they had been in danger, and entirely unaware that a human scientist on a survey vessel had decided that their lives were worth 18 months of quiet, exhausting work with no recognition at the end of it. Nathan Cole stood at the center of the hall and said nothing. He did not need to say anything. The data said everything. He looked once, briefly, at Ambassador Lyris. She was very still. Her silver hands were flat on the table in front of her. Her eyes were on the projection surface where Carol Fenn's mission logs were still scrolling slowly. She was reading every word. Owen Park was gripping the edge of the table without realizing it. Diane Walsh, behind him, exhaled very slowly and quietly through her nose. It was the only movement she made. The gold light of the verification pillar continued to glow steadily at the center of the hall, patient and unhurried, as if it had all the time in the universe to let the room understand what it had just learned. The Conclave moderator called a recess 30 seconds after the last of Carol Fenn's mission logs finished scrolling across the projection surface. He did not explain why. He did not need to. The room needed to breathe, and everyone in it knew it. The formal announcement was just the moderator giving the hall permission to do what it was already doing. Exhaling, turning to the person beside them, speaking in low, urgent voices in 14 different languages about what they had just seen. The delegates moved out through the wide side doors into the connecting corridors of Verath Station. Aides clustered around their respective ambassadors. Some moved quickly. Some moved slowly, the way people move when their legs are working but their minds are somewhere else entirely. Owen Park walked out with the human delegation and stood near the curved observation window at the end of the corridor. Outside the window, open space stretched in every direction, deep and black and scattered with the cold light of distant stars. He stared at it for a moment without really seeing it. Then he looked at Nathan Cole, who had found a small bench against the wall and sat down on it and was quietly pouring coffee from his thermos into the small cup attached to its top. Owen wanted to ask something. He had about 15 questions competing to come out of his mouth first. Before any of them could win, an aide from the Vreth delegation appeared at the edge of the corridor and spoke quietly to Diane Walsh, who was standing nearby with her arms at her sides and her eyes doing their usual careful work of checking everything. The aide said that Ambassador Lyris was requesting a private meeting with the head of the human delegation. Diane looked at Nathan. Nathan looked up from his coffee. He thought about it for approximately 2 seconds and then nodded. The meeting room they were given was small by Verath Station standards, which meant it was still larger than most rooms on an average human transport vessel. It had a round table, 6 chairs, and a long window that looked out over the docking arms of the station where dozens of ships sat in their moorings like sleeping animals. The light in the room was softer than the light in the hall. It made everything feel slightly less formal, which was probably intentional. Lyris was already there when they arrived. She had come alone. No aides, no security, no junior diplomats hovering at her shoulder. For a Vreth ambassador of her rank, this was so unusual that Owen, upon entering and seeing her sitting by herself at the round table, momentarily forgot how to walk normally and had to consciously remind his legs what they were for. Diane took a position near the door without being asked. Owen sat down near the window. Nathan sat down across from Lyris, set his thermos on the table, and looked at her with the same calm and open expression he seemed to carry everywhere. The expression of a man who was genuinely prepared to listen to whatever came next. Lyris looked at the thermos for a moment. There was something in the way she looked at it. Not dismissive now, not the quick glance of someone uninterested. More like she was seeing it properly for the first time and finding it harder to read than she expected. She asked him why it was never reported. She did not say good afternoon first. She did not go through the formal greeting structure that Vreth diplomacy required in almost every other context. She just asked the question directly, which told Nathan and Diane and even Owen that she had spent the recess thinking about almost nothing else. Nathan picked up his thermos and, entirely out of the habit of a man who had sat across from many people in many difficult conversations and always defaulted to small human courtesies, offered her some coffee. She looked at the thermos again. Then she held out the small ceremonial cup that was part of her ambassador's formal attire. A cup meant for traditional Vreth liquids at official functions, a cup that had almost certainly never had coffee poured into it in its existence. Nathan poured. She wrapped both silver hands around it and held it but did not drink yet. He answered her question. He told her that Carol Fenn's team had sat down together after mapping the full spread of the contaminant and asked themselves one question. If we do nothing, how many people are we looking at? They had run the numbers. The numbers were very large. After that, the question of whether to act had not really felt like a question anymore. It felt more like the only available answer. Lyris listened. Then she asked why no report was filed afterward. Why no one told the Dominion what had been done. Why humanity had taken nothing from it. No credit, no leverage, no political capital. Nathan said that Carol Fenn's team had discussed that too, and the conclusion they came to was simple. If they told the Dominion would want to know who engineered the contaminant. That investigation would have pulled in 3 other civilizations, and the political damage would have spread outward like a crack in glass. They had decided the quieter outcome was the better one. The Dominion's people were safe. That was the part that needed to happen. Everything else was secondary. Lyris was quiet for a long moment. She looked down at the cup in her hands. Then she looked back up. She told him that the Vreth Dominion had held significant standing in the Conclave for 300 years. That in 300 years, every action her civilization had taken in relation to others had been measured first. Measured for what it would return. Influence, resources, strategic position, long-term advantage. She said she had grown up in a system where acting without a calculated return was considered naive at best and foolish at worst. She said she genuinely could not understand what Carol Fenn had been calculating when she made her choice. Nathan looked at her steadily. He said that humans calculated returns too. He said they were not as selfless as the story might make them sound. He said that humans were actually quite selfish in one particular way. They found it very uncomfortable to know that people were going to die when they had the ability to prevent it. That discomfort was selfish in a sense, because removing it was partly about making themselves feel better. But the result of removing it was that the people who would have died did not die. So the math, from where he was sitting, still worked out. Lyris looked at him for a long time after that. The kind of long time that meant she was doing something complicated behind her eyes. Then she looked at the cup in her hands and finally took a small, careful sip of the coffee. Her expression shifted slightly. It was not clear whether she liked it, but she did not put the cup down. She stood eventually and prepared to leave. At the door, she paused and turned back and said one more thing. She said that what she had said in the hall, before the pillar activated, she said it without sufficient information. Nathan said that was all right. He said it happened. She left. Owen waited until her footsteps had faded down the corridor and then turned to Diane Walsh and said quietly that he had not expected her to come alone. Diane said she had. Owen looked at her. He asked if Diane had known about Carol Fenn's mission before today, before the pillar activated, before any of it. Diane was quiet for a moment. Outside the window, a large transport vessel was slowly easing out of its docking arm, its running lights moving in a long, steady arc against the dark. She said yes, she had known. Owen asked how. Diane picked up her cup from the windowsill, took a sip, and said that she had been the one who coordinated the logistics team 7 years ago. She had been the one who looked at Carol Fenn's report and spent 48 hours figuring out whether the neutralization operation was actually possible. She had been the one who told Carol yes. Owen stared at her. Diane looked back at him with the calm, flat expression of someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that the most important things she had ever done were things she could not talk about. She said very simply that the coffee on Varath Station was terrible and that she had been looking forward to Nathan's thermos since they left Earth. Then she walked back toward the hall because the recess was almost over, and there was still a great deal of the day left. The delegates filed back into the grand conclave hall the way water fills a container, slowly at first, then all at once. The energy in the room was different now. Before the recess, it had been the comfortable energy of a gathering where everyone knew their place and the order of things was settled and familiar. Now it was something else. Quieter in some ways, more careful. The kind of energy that fills a room when people are thinking hard and trying not to show how hard they are thinking. Owen Park took his seat and looked around the hall. He had spent 8 months studying these delegations, and he knew their habits well enough to read the small things. The Grath representatives were leaning slightly toward each other, which meant they were recalibrating something. The Solon cluster delegates were sitting very straight and very still, which for their species meant focused attention rather than indifference. Several of the smaller delegations that had laughed, or come close to laughing, during Lyris's interruption earlier, were now sitting with the particular careful blankness of people who hoped no one had noticed what their faces had done. Ambassador Lyris sat at the Vreth table and looked straight ahead. She had her hands folded in front of her. She had sent her aides to their seats. She was composed, but it was the composure of someone who had chosen it deliberately, rather than someone for whom it came naturally in this moment. Nathan Cole sat at the human table with his notebook open and his thermos beside it. He looked, to anyone watching, exactly the same as he had looked at the beginning of the session. Unremarkable, unhurried, entirely at ease. The conclave moderator brought the session back to order and then did what the formal process required. He announced that the sealed evidence cache submitted by the human delegation had been verified as authentic in all its components by the conclave's independent review system. He announced that under Article 41 of the conclave charter, the actions documented within the cache qualified for formal recognition. He announced that humanity was therefore to receive the conclave's commendation of distinguished galactic service, the highest formal recognition the conclave could bestow, which had not been awarded to any civilization in 114 years. The last civilization to receive it had been the Vreth Dominion. The moderator said this without emphasis. He was good at his job. A sound moved through the hall. Not applause. The conclave did not do applause. It was more like a collective shift, the sound of 14 delegations adjusting in their seats at the same moment, processing the same information from different angles. Owen watched Ambassador Lyris during the announcement. Her expression did not change, but she blinked twice in quick succession, which Owen had learned from his preparation reading was the Vreth equivalent of a sharp intake of breath. Then the moderator finished the formal recognition and returned the floor to open session. And Nathan Cole stood up. He opened his notebook to the same page he had been on before, the page he had been reading from when Lyris interrupted him. He found the exact line where he had stopped, and he began to speak again, in the same calm and even voice, picking up from the precise sentence where Ambassador Lyris had cut him off, as if no time had passed at all, as if the interruption and the evidence and the recess and the private meeting and the commendation had all been a brief pause in a conversation he intended to finish. Owen Park felt something move in his chest that he did not have an exact word for. Nathan talked about the relay stations again, briefly, finishing the point he had not been allowed to finish before. Then he moved to the next item. A water reclamation technology that a team of human engineers had spent 3 years developing and had then offered freely to 2 civilizations whose planets had been experiencing severe water scarcity. No trade agreement attached, no repayment terms. The technology had been handed over with full documentation and the offer of technical support during installation. Both civilizations were represented at the table today. Neither of them said anything, but the lead delegate from one of them, a quiet and elderly being from the Pathari Federation, lowered his head slightly when the item was mentioned. It was a small movement. Nathan did not acknowledge it. He just moved to the next point. He talked about a search and rescue framework that humanity had built over the past 6 years. A network of response protocols, trained crews, and pre-positioned supply caches along the most dangerous deep space corridors in the region. He said that the framework was available to any vessel from any civilization that found itself in distress in those corridors. No fees, no political requirements, no questions asked about why the vessel was there or who it belonged to. He listed the number of ships the framework had already recovered, 61 vessels, 11 different civilizations represented among them. He did not name the civilizations. He did not need to. Several of the delegates at the table knew their own ships were on that list. He talked about a research partnership between 3 human universities and the medical institutions of 2 other species, a partnership that had produced a treatment for a degenerative nerve condition that affected populations across 4 different civilizations. He mentioned it the same way he mentioned everything else, calmly, without decoration. He spoke for 9 minutes in total. When he reached the end of his notes, he looked up at the hall, closed his notebook, and thanked the conclave for their time. Then he sat down. For a moment, the hall did nothing. It just held the silence the way a room holds heat, evenly and completely. Then Ambassador Lyris stood up. She did not ask the moderator for the floor. She simply stood, and the moderator, reading the room with the professional instinct of someone who had been doing this for a long time, did not stop her. She stood at her full height, and she looked across the hall at the human delegations table, at the man with the notebook and the thermos and the plain jacket and the expression that gave nothing away because there was nothing being hidden, because he was simply exactly what he appeared to be. And she inclined her head. It was not a bow. The Vreth did not bow. It was something more precise than that. A lowering of the head and a slight forward movement of the shoulders that in Vreth diplomatic language meant something that did not translate perfectly into any other tongue, but came closest to, I see you. I was wrong in how I was seeing you before. I see you now. It lasted 3 seconds. Then she straightened and sat back down. The Patari elder moved next. He inclined his head the same way, or as close to it as his species' physiology allowed. Then the lead delegate from the Solon cluster. Then 2 others from smaller civilizations near the edge of the table, civilizations that did not have strong alliances with anyone, and therefore had the freedom to respond to what they felt rather than what was politically convenient. Not everyone moved. Several delegations sat still, their faces neutral, their calculations running behind their eyes. That was all right. Nathan did not look at the ones who moved. He did not look at the ones who did not. He poured himself a small amount of coffee from his thermos and looked at his notebook, and appeared to be reviewing his notes for no reason other than that he was the kind of man who reviewed his notes. Owen Park sat very still in his chair and stared at the surface of the table, and breathed carefully through his nose because his eyes were doing something he did not want them to do in the grand conclave hall of Varath Station in front of 14 alien civilizations. Diane Walsh, behind him, reached forward and placed one hand briefly on his shoulder. She did not say anything. She did not need to. The moderator moved the session forward. There were other items on the agenda, other civilizations with things to present. The conclave continued, as it always did, because the business of the galaxy did not pause for moments, no matter how large those moments were. But the gold light of the verification pillar, which had dimmed after the evidence was entered into record, had not gone completely dark. It sat at a low, steady glow, just above its baseline, as if the system was not quite finished yet, as if it was waiting, patiently, for something else. The session ended 3 hours later. The formal closing was brief, as it always was. The moderator read the summary of decisions made, the items entered into record, the schedule for the next conclave gathering. The delegates stood. The banners were dimmed in the traditional closing sequence, one by one, starting from the oldest civilization at the table and ending with the newest. Humanity's banner was last. It dimmed like the others, quietly and without ceremony, and then the hall began to empty. Varath Station came alive in a different way after a conclave session closed. The formal corridors filled with the informal business that could not be done in the hall itself. Delegates who could not speak freely at the table found each other in the wide, curved walkways and the observation lounges and the small restaurants that served food from a dozen different worlds. Aides moved quickly between meetings that did not officially exist. Political analysts from 3 different news organizations that covered galactic affairs were already transmitting their early reports back to their home systems, their voices low and rapid, their eyes bright with the particular excitement of people who understood that what they had witnessed today was not a normal session. Owen Park walked slowly. He had no urgent meetings. Nathan had told him to take the remaining hours before their departure and use them however he wanted. So he walked through the station with his hands in his pockets and his mind turning over everything that had happened since morning, trying to find the shape of it, trying to understand how a day that had started with an old man setting a thermos on a table had ended with something that would be in the galactic record for the rest of recorded history. He stopped at a wide observation window on the station's outer ring. The view from this window was different from the one in the meeting room. This one looked outward, away from the docking arms, away from the ships and the station infrastructure, straight out into open space. Stars in every direction. Endless and cold and very beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they are too large to fully understand. He was standing there when he heard footsteps beside him and turned to find a young Vreth aide stopping at the same window. The aide was around Owen's age, maybe younger, with the pale silver skin of a Vreth who had not yet spent enough years in artificial station light to develop the deeper tones that came with age. He was in the junior diplomatic uniform of the Vreth Dominion, and he looked slightly uncertain about whether approaching the window while a human was already standing there was acceptable or not. Owen nodded at him. The aide nodded back. They stood together for a moment looking at the stars. Then the aide spoke. His translation unit rendered his words in clean, flat English, the way all the translation units in the conclave did, stripping out tone and leaving only meaning. He asked Owen how humans decided who to help. Owen looked at him. The question was direct in the way that young people's questions are direct when they have been turning something over for hours and have finally decided to just ask it out loud. Owen thought about it seriously. He looked at the stars and he thought about Carol Fenn on her survey vessel, running her tests, finding something in the data that did not belong there, sitting with it, understanding what it meant. He thought about Diane Walsh getting a report and spending 48 hours figuring out if something impossible was actually possible. He thought about Nathan Cole sitting in a conclave hall with a notebook and a thermos, not because he was trying to prove anything, but because someone had to be there, and he was the one who was there. Owen said he did not think there was a system exactly. He said that from everything he had seen and everything he was only now beginning to understand, it seemed like humans tended to notice when something was wrong, and then they tended to feel bad about it. Not in a distant, abstract way, in a close and personal way, the way you feel bad about something that is happening to someone standing right next to you, even if they are not right next to you at all. And then, because of that feeling, they found it very difficult to just continue on with whatever they were doing before they noticed. He said some people called that a flaw. He said he had heard it described as impractical and inefficient and driven by emotion rather than reason. He said that in certain diplomatic and strategic circles, it was considered a weakness of the human decision-making process. The Vreth aide was quiet for a moment. Then he said that it did not sound like a flaw to him. Owen looked at him. The aide was still looking at the stars, his expression thoughtful and young and genuinely uncertain in a way that felt honest. Owen said that no, he supposed it did not always feel like one. They stood together a little longer, and then the aide's communicator signaled and he nodded at Owen again and walked back toward the Vreth delegation section of the station. Owen watched him go and then turned back to the window and stayed there a while longer by himself. Across the station, in the human delegation's assigned quarters, Nathan Cole was asleep in a chair. He had sat down to review his notes after the session and had fallen asleep within 10 minutes, which was something he did with great regularity after long days, and felt no embarrassment about whatsoever. His notebook was on his chest, rising and falling with his breathing. His thermos was on the floor beside the chair, standing upright, which said something about the habits of a man who had learned through long experience that a thermos on its side is a thermos with a problem. His personal communicator on the desk beside him had several unread messages, reports from the delegation, a note from the moderator's office regarding the formal commendation documentation, 3 messages from journalists who had somehow obtained his contact information despite his considerable efforts to prevent exactly that, and 1 message from Carol Fenn. It had come in 6 hours ago, sent from deep space, from whatever distant survey route Carol was working now. The message was 3 paragraphs long, which for Carol was lengthy. She was not a person who used words carelessly or in large quantities. She said she had been near a small Lithani colony world for the past 2 weeks, running routine biological drift surveys in the outer atmosphere. She said that during the survey she had detected a minor anomaly in the colony's water table data. Probably nothing. A natural mineral variation, most likely, the kind of thing that showed up in survey data all the time and meant nothing. But the pattern of it was slightly unusual, and she wanted to look at it more carefully before moving on. She said she would send a full report in a few days once she had more data. She said sorry for the short message. She had surveys to run. Nathan's reply was sitting in his outbox, unsent, because he had started typing it and then fallen asleep before finishing it, which was also something he did with great regularity. The reply said, "Good. Let me know what you find. Take whatever time you need." Then there was a long pause in the typing, visible in the way the message simply stopped mid-thought, and then it continued. It said, "The conclave heard about it today. All of it. The full record. Every part of the mission. I thought you should know. The hall was very quiet when they finished reading your logs. The kind of quiet that means something landed the way it was supposed to." Then the message stopped again. Then one more line, clearly added just before he fell asleep. The letters slightly uneven in the way that typing gets uneven when a person is fighting to keep their eyes open. It said, "You did good, Carol. You did real good." The message sat there unsent, waiting for him to wake up and find it and press send, which he would do eventually, because Nathan Cole was also not a person who left important things unfinished. Outside the station, the human delegation's transport vessel sat in its docking arm, being readied for departure. The crew ran their checks. The systems came online one by one. In a few hours, it would ease out of the dock and into open space and begin the long journey back toward human territory. It would pass, on that journey, the outer marker buoys of the Vreth Dominion. It would pass the relay stations that human engineers had built along the corridor, their signal lights blinking in the dark at steady intervals like a long line of patient sentinels. It would pass through regions of space where 61 vessels had been pulled back from the edge of disaster by crews who asked no questions and expected nothing in return. And somewhere out beyond all of that, further than the transport would travel, further than the conclave's reach, in the cold, quiet dark near a small colony world most of the galaxy had never heard of, Carol Fenn's survey vessel moved slowly through the outer atmosphere, running its instruments carefully over the water table data, looking at the numbers, looking at the pattern, trying to decide if what she was seeing was nothing or something. She had a feeling it was something. She always had that feeling just before it turned out to be something, so she kept looking. Because that was what she did. Because someone had to. Because the alternative, turning the instruments off and moving on and leaving the question unanswered, was something she had never once in her career been able to make herself do. The stars were very bright out here. She made herself another cup of something warm and got back to work.